Before that day, I would have told you that I had learned how to disappear politely, not vanish, just soften, lower my voice, take up less space, smile when spoken over, nod when assumptions were made about what I did or didn't understand. It's a skill women my age learn without ever being taught. So when my daughter dragged me into court over my husband's will, I wasn't shocked by the lawsuit itself. I was shocked by how confident she looked doing it. Because my husband, Charles Whitfield, left everything to me, every account, every property, every investment, and our daughter, Marissa Hale, got nothing. That single fact explains every word written on the court documents. Every whisper in the hallway, every smug glance she and her husband, Greg, shared when they thought I wasn't paying attention. They said I was naive. They said I'd been manipulated. They said I couldn't possibly understand what Charles had done. And on the morning we walked into that courtroom, they laughed. Not openly, not cruelly, just enough. Enough to tell me they were certain this would end in their favor. You see, when I walked in that day, I looked exactly like the woman they expected me to be. Older, quiet, carrying an old handbag that had seen better decades. Wearing shoes chosen for comfort, not for power. Marissa leaned toward Greg and said something under her breath. He smirked. Her attorney, Daniel Crowe, didn't bother to hide his confidence. They thought this would be easy. They thought I was confused. They thought they knew who I was. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly judged, consider staying with me. These stories don't unfold loudly, but they matter. Now let me take you back to where this truly began, not the courtroom, but the day Charles died. I was holding his hand when it happened. 37 years of marriage, ending not with drama, but with silence. The machine slowed, then stopped. And just before his eyes closed, he looked at me, not weak, not afraid, but certain. They're going to question you, he whispered. Let them. That was the last thing my husband ever said to me. Charles had always understood people better than they understood him, especially Marissa. Our daughter loved her father, I believe that. But she also loved certainty, control. Outcomes she could predict. And in her mind, her inheritance had always been one of those outcomes. The reading of the will happened 2 weeks later. Marissa arrived dressed for mourning, but not for surprise. She brought tissues. Greg brought confidence. They sat close together, hands intertwined, already calculating what they believed was coming. When the attorney read the words to my wife, Eleanor Whitfield, I leave my entire estate, the room didn't erupt. It froze. Marissa didn't cry, she didn't shout. She stared, then she laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. That can't be right, she said. Mom doesn't even handle the bills. Greg leaned forward. We'll need to review those documents. I remember the way Charles's chair sat empty beside me, how calm I felt, how certain, because this wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. Within days, the tone shifted. Concern replaced grief. Questions replaced condolences. Are you sure you understand what this means? Dad wouldn't want you overwhelmed. Maybe we should help manage things. And when I said no, politely, calmly, the concern curdled. That's when the lawsuit arrived. Filed by my own daughter, claiming I was mentally unfit, suggesting I had been manipulated, implying fraud where there was none. The paperwork spoke about me as if I were already gone. When I read it, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I didn't cry. I remembered something Charles used to say whenever people underestimated him. Let them believe the story that comforts them, because comfort makes people careless. Which brings us back to the courtroom. Marissa sat straight-backed and smiling. Greg looked relaxed. Daniel Crowe shuffled his papers like a man already planning his closing remarks. And then the judge entered, Judge Rebecca Lawson. She took her seat, looked down at the case file, looked up, and paused, just for a moment, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to see recognition flicker across her face. Marissa missed it entirely. She was too busy believing the version of me she'd created. The helpless one, the confused one, the woman who needed protecting from herself. Judge Lawson cleared her throat, and that was the moment I knew something had shifted, not in the room, but in the story Marissa thought she was telling. Because when people build their confidence on assumptions, they rarely notice when the ground beneath them starts to move. And as the clerk called the case to order, I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Not nervously, patiently, because I had spent years letting my daughter believe she understood me, and now she was about to learn how expensive that mistake was. and it would only take one sentence from the judge to change everything. When Judge Rebecca Lawson finally spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise itself to be heard. "Mr. Crow," she said, eyes still resting on the file in front of her, "before we proceed, I want to clarify the nature of this petition." Daniel Crow stood smoothly, already in performance mode. "Your Honor, this is a standard competency challenge. Mrs. Whitfield's late husband left her a substantial estate and there are reasonable concerns." Judge Lawson raised one finger. "Concerns based on what exactly?" The room shifted. Marissa glanced at Greg, still smiling faintly as if this were all part of a predictable script. "Based on behavioral observations," Daniel continued. "Confusion, forgetfulness, difficulty managing finances." "I see," Judge Lawson said. "And how long have you personally interacted with Mrs. Whitfield?" Daniel hesitated. "Briefly, Your Honor." "Minutes?" she asked. "Yes." Judge Lawson nodded slowly, then looked at me. "Mrs. Whitfield, you're representing yourself today. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Marissa leaned back in her chair. That was when I understood something clearly. She wasn't worried. She thought this was already over. Daniel began presenting his case. He spoke gently, almost kindly, the way people do when they want the court to see them as reasonable. He described me as a grieving widow who had suddenly been placed in an overwhelming financial position. He referenced my age without saying the number out loud. He talked about my limited background. Every sentence was designed to sound compassionate. None of it sounded true. When he finished, Judge Lawson turned to me. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "would you like to respond?" I stood slowly. I didn't rush, because rushing looks like fear. "Your Honor," I said, "my daughter believes that because I didn't handle the finances publicly during my marriage, I must not understand them." Marissa scoffed quietly. Judge Lawson noticed. "Mrs. Hale," she said sharply, "you'll refrain from commentary." I continued. "My husband and I discussed our estate planning for years. The will reflects his intentions clearly and legally. I understand its contents completely." Daniel stepped in. "Your Honor, with respect, understanding a document and understanding how to manage a complex estate are not the same." Judge Lawson cut him off. "Mr. Crow, this court doesn't measure competency by assumptions. It measures evidence." She turned back to me. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you understand the approximate value of your husband's estate?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand the tax implications?" "Yes." "Do you understand the responsibilities involved in managing it?" "Yes." Marissa's posture stiffened. Daniel cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we're requesting a full evaluation to determine, based on what?" Judge Lawson asked again. Daniel faltered. "Based on the daughter's observations." Judge Lawson looked directly at Marissa. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "why do you believe your mother is incompetent?" Marissa stood. Her voice was polished, confident. "She forgets things," she said. "She asks for help with basic tasks. She didn't even understand how to transfer money online." I met her eyes. She didn't look away. Judge Lawson turned back to me. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you require assistance with online banking?" "Occasionally," I said. "The same way many people do." Judge Lawson nodded. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "did your mother ever fail to recognize you? Forget where she lived, make decisions that endangered herself?" Marissa hesitated. "No." Greg shifted in his seat. Daniel interjected. "Your Honor, early-stage impairment doesn't always." Judge Lawson raised her hand. "I'm aware," she said, "but courts do not strip adults of autonomy based on inconvenience." She paused, then asked me something unexpected. "Mrs. Whitfield, what was your profession before your marriage?" The room went very still. Marissa frowned. "I stayed home," she said quickly. "She didn't have a career." Judge Lawson didn't look at her. She was looking at me. I smiled gently. "Before I married Charles," I said, "I practiced law." Marissa laughed, out loud this time. Daniel blinked. Judge Lawson leaned forward. "Practiced?" she repeated. "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel recovered quickly. "With respect, Your Honor, even if that were true, it would have been decades ago." Judge Lawson's eyes flicked to him. "Mr. Crow," she said evenly, "this court verifies credentials." She turned to me. "Mrs. Whitfield, what kind of law?" I reached into my handbag, slowly, calmly, and placed my bar card on the table. "Criminal defense," I said, "for 15 years. The sound that followed wasn't a gasp, it was silence. "The kind that lands heavy?" Marissa's smile vanished. Greg's face drained of color. Daniel stared at the card like it might disappear if he blinked. Judge Lawson studied it, then looked up at me, not surprised, just impressed. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, why was this not mentioned in the petition? Daniel swallowed. Your Honor, we were unaware. Judge Lawson's expression hardened. You were unaware because you didn't ask. She leaned back in her chair. And now, she said slowly, this court needs to ask a very different question. Marissa gripped Greg's arm. Judge Lawson looked directly at her. Mrs. Hale, did you file this petition because you believed your mother was incompetent? She paused. Or because you didn't like what your father chose to leave her? Marissa opened her mouth. No words came out. And for the first time since my husband died, I saw fear replace certainty in my daughter's eyes. Because the story she brought into that courtroom was falling apart, and we were only just beginning. Next, the court would look not at me, but at the people who claimed to know me best. After the bar card touched the table, the courtroom didn't erupt the way television dramas like to pretend it does. No gasps, no shouting, just a subtle, unmistakable shift in power. Judge Rebecca Lawson leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, her eyes moving not to me but to Daniel Crowe. And for the first time since the hearing began, he looked uncertain, not flustered, not panicked, but aware. Mrs. Whitfield, the judge said calmly, you stated you practiced criminal defense law for 15 years. Yes, Your Honor. And when did you stop? When I chose to, I replied. After I married my husband and became pregnant with our daughter. Marissa shifted sharply in her seat. Judge Lawson nodded. So this was not due to disbarment, incapacity, or professional misconduct. No, I said. It was a personal decision. Daniel cleared his throat. Your Honor, even so, this does not automatically negate concerns about present-day competency. You're right, Judge Lawson replied evenly. Which is why this court does not rely on assumptions. She turned her attention to Marissa. Mrs. Hale, she said, I want to return to your testimony. Marissa straightened, regaining some of her earlier composure. She had always been good at that, presenting confidence even when she felt cornered. You testified that your mother appeared confused after your father's death, the judge continued. Can you give a specific example? Marissa nodded quickly. She asked me how to move money between accounts. She needed help understanding online banking. Judge Lawson turned to me. Mrs. Whitfield, did you ask your daughter for help with these tasks? Yes, I said. And why? I didn't hesitate. Because I wanted to see how she would respond when she believed I needed her. The room went very still. Daniel stood. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Judge Lawson raised a hand. Let her finish. I looked at my daughter. After my husband died, I continued, I noticed how quickly conversations shifted from concern to control. I was advised. I was spoken over. I was treated as though grief had erased my judgment. Marissa shook her head. That's not fair. Judge Lawson silenced her with a glance. I asked for help, I said. Not because I lacked understanding, but because I wanted to understand them. Daniel frowned. So you deliberately misrepresented your capabilities? I allowed others to underestimate me, I replied calmly. There is a difference. Judge Lawson's expression remained unreadable. Mrs. Hale, she said, when your mother asked for assistance, how did you feel? Marissa hesitated. I felt concerned. Concerned for her, the judge clarified, or concerned about the estate? Greg stiffened beside her. Marissa swallowed. Both. Judge Lawson nodded once. That's an honest answer. Daniel interjected quickly. Your Honor, grief can distort perception. Even intelligent individuals can make poor judgments, which is why, Judge Lawson said, we examine behavior, not stereotypes. She turned back to me. Mrs. Whitfield, did you ever fail to pay bills, miss deadlines, make reckless financial decisions? No. Did any medical professional ever express concern regarding your cognitive health? No. Did you sign any documents you did not understand? No. Judge Lawson looked down at her notes, then back up at Daniel. Mr. Crowe, do you have medical evidence of impairment? Daniel adjusted his tie. Not at this time. Do you have financial mismanagement records? No. Then what you have, Judge Lawson said evenly, is a disagreement over inheritance, not incompetence. Marissa's face flushed. This isn't about money, she insisted. It's about my mother being taken advantage of. Judge Lawson tilted her head slightly. By whom? Marissa opened her mouth, then stopped. Because there was no answer that didn't implicate her father's will, her husband's expectations, or her own assumptions. Greg leaned forward for the first time. Your Honor, with respect, my wife and I simply believe a leaner is overwhelmed. Judge Lawson turned to him. Mr. Hale, she said, how long have you known your mother-in-law? 7 years. And during that time, the judge continued, did you ever discuss her professional background? Greg hesitated. No. Did you ever ask? No, Judge Lawson nodded. That seems to be a recurring theme. Daniel stood again, his voice sharper now. Your Honor, regardless of past credentials, Mrs. Whitfield concealed relevant information from her family. Judge Lawson looked directly at him. Mr. Crow, she said, is it your position that privacy equals deception? Daniel paused. No, Your Honor. Then we are done with that line of argument. She closed the file gently. This court will not order a competency evaluation based on speculation, discomfort, or disappointment. Marissa inhaled sharply. Judge Lawson continued. However, she said, this hearing has raised serious questions about motive. Marissa looked up. What do you mean? I mean, Judge Lawson said calmly, that attempting to strip a competent adult of legal autonomy is not a neutral act. It carries consequences. She looked at Daniel. And before this court considers any further motions, I expect a full explanation of why this petition was filed without due diligence. Daniel's jaw tightened. Judge Lawson turned to me. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, you may remain seated. She paused, then added quietly, but I suspect you already knew that. I met her eyes and smiled. As the judge called for a recess, Marissa finally looked at me, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with something far more unsettling. Recognition, because she was beginning to understand that this case was no longer about what her father left behind. It was about what she had never bothered to learn. And when court resumed, the focus would shift entirely. From whether I was competent to whether they had acted in good faith at all. When court resumed, the room felt different. Not louder, not tenser, heavier. Like everyone understood now that something irreversible had already happened, even if the verdict hadn't been spoken yet. Marissa no longer leaned comfortably toward Greg. She sat straighter, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Greg had stopped pretending to be relaxed altogether. Daniel Crow, for the first time, was flipping through his notes instead of gliding through them. Judge Rebecca Lawson returned and took her seat without ceremony. Before we continue, she said, this court needs to clarify intent. She looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Crow, when this petition was filed, did you or your clients conduct any independent verification of Mrs. Whitfield's professional background? Daniel hesitated just long enough for the answer to be obvious. No, Your Honor, Judge Lawson nodded slowly. And did you request any medical evaluations before alleging mental incompetence? No. Did you speak with Mrs. Whitfield's physicians? No. Did you interview neutral third parties? No. Each answer landed harder than the last. Judge Lawson closed the file in front of her. So what you filed, she said evenly, was not a protective measure, it was a presumption. Marissa spoke up, her voice tight. Your Honor, we were acting out of concern, my mother was grieving. She was secretive, she refused help. Judge Lawson turned to her. Mrs. Hale, she said, grief does not equal incompetence and privacy is not a crime. Marissa swallowed. She didn't tell us who she really was, Marissa insisted. She hid things. I stood then, not defensively, not dramatically, just calmly. Your Honor, I said, may I clarify something? Judge Lawson nodded. My daughter did not know who I was because I hid it, I said. She didn't know because she never asked. Marissa flinched. For 30 years, I continued, I was mom. The woman who cooked, organized, supported, that role was convenient. My past didn't matter to her as long as I stayed inside that box. Daniel interjected, Your Honor, relevance? Judge Lawson raised her hand. This is relevant. I continued. When Charles and I discussed his will, I said, he didn't choose me because I was helpless. He chose me because he trusted me. Judge Lawson nodded slightly. And trust, she said, is a legal consideration. She turned to Daniel again. Mr. Crow, are you familiar with the statutory standard for incompetence? Yes, Your Honor. Please state it for the record. Daniel cleared his throat. An inability to understand the nature and consequences of one's decisions. Judge Lawson turned to me. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, do you understand the nature of the inheritance left to you? Yes. Do you understand its scope? Yes. Do you understand its consequences? Yes. She paused. Then we are done pretending this is ambiguous. Greg finally spoke, his voice edged with frustration. So you're just taking her side? Judge Lawson's eyes snapped to him. This court does not take sides, she said sharply. It evaluates evidence, something you and your wife should have done before bringing this petition. Greg leaned back, chastened. Judge Lawson continued. There is another matter this court must address. She looked at the file again. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, you mentioned earlier that your husband anticipated this challenge. Yes. Did he take steps to document his intent? Yes, Your Honor. I reached into my bag, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed a sealed envelope on the table. This contains a notarized letter written by my husband 6 months before his death, I said. Addressed to this court? Daniel stiffened. Judge Lawson accepted it, read silently, then looked up. Her expression had changed, not surprise. Understanding, she looked at Marissa. Your father explicitly stated that he did not want his estate used as leverage against his wife, Judge Lawson said. He anticipated precisely this action. Marissa's face drained of color. He said, the judge continued, my wife knows exactly what she is doing. If this will is challenged, it will not be out of confusion but entitlement. The words hung in the air. Greg stared at Marissa. Daniel exhaled slowly. Judge Lawson folded the letter and set it aside. This court does not look kindly on attempts to undermine testamentary intent without cause, she said. She leaned forward. And this court looks even less kindly on efforts to weaponize age, grief, or gender. Marissa's voice broke. I just wanted what was fair. Judge Lawson met her gaze. What you wanted, she said gently but firmly, is not the legal standard. She looked back at me. Mrs. Whitfield, you have demonstrated clarity, preparation, and restraint. That tells this court more than any accusation ever could. I sat down slowly, not triumphant, just steady. Judge Lawson glanced at the clock. This court will issue its ruling shortly, she said. But I will say this now. She looked directly at Marissa and Greg. You walked into this courtroom believing you knew exactly who Alina Whitfield was. She paused. You were wrong. Marissa lowered her eyes. And as the judge called for final statements, I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory, closure. Because no matter how the ruling was phrased, one truth was already undeniable. They hadn't lost control in that courtroom. They had never had it, and when the judge spoke next, the room would never sound the same again. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the air vents above us. Judge Rebecca Lawson hadn't ruled yet, but she didn't need to. Anyone paying attention could already feel where this was going. Still, the most dangerous moments in cases like this aren't the verdicts. They're the last attempts. Daniel Crowe stood once more, smoothing his jacket like a man trying to regain footing on ground that had shifted beneath him. Your Honor, he said, before the court issues its ruling, my clients would like to make a statement. Marissa inhaled sharply as if she hadn't expected this moment to arrive so soon. Greg leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she shook her head and stood on her own. Go ahead, Judge Lawson said. Marissa turned to face me, not the judge, me. Mom, she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. This never had to go this far. I kept my hands folded. You shut us out, she continued. You wouldn't let us help. You made decisions without us. Judge Lawson raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Marissa took that as permission. We were scared, she said. Dad was gone, everything changed overnight, we didn't recognize you anymore. I finally looked at her. Because I stopped asking for permission? I asked quietly, her eyes flickered. Because you stopped letting us in, she replied. Judge Lawson leaned forward. Mrs. Hale, she said, are you suggesting that autonomy is abandonment? Marissa faltered. No, Your Honor, I'm just saying families make decisions together. Only when invited, the judge replied calmly. Daniel interjected quickly. Your Honor, my client is simply expressing emotional distress. Surely the court can acknowledge emotional distress, Judge Lawson said, does not justify filing a petition alleging mental incompetence without evidence. She turned to Marissa again. Mrs. Hale, did you consider mediation before filing this lawsuit? Marissa hesitated. No. Did you request a medical evaluation before accusing your mother of incapacity? No. Did you ask her directly why your father left the estate as he did? Marissa swallowed. No, Judge Lawson nodded. That answers my question. Greg stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, he snapped. We're being treated like villains for trying to protect our family. Judge Lawson's gaze hardened. Mr. Hale, she said, you are not on trial, your actions are. Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. Because for the first time, someone wasn't letting him dominate the room. I stood then not to argue but to finish something that had been sitting in my chest for months. Your Honor, I said, may I speak? Judge Lawson nodded. I turned not to the bench but to my daughter. Marissa, I said, when your father was alive, he watched you carefully. He watched how you spoke to me, how you spoke about me. Her face flushed. He saw how quickly concern turned into calculation. How help came with conditions. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He told me once, I continued, that the greatest mistake parents make is assuming love automatically includes respect. Marissa's eyes filled with tears. You never told me he felt that way, she whispered. You never asked, I replied gently. Judge Lawson folded her hands. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, your husband's letter indicates he anticipated this conflict. Yes, I said. He hoped it wouldn't happen, but he prepared for it. Daniel cleared his throat again, one final attempt. Your Honor, he said, even if the petition is denied, perhaps the court could recommend shared oversight to preserve family harmony. Judge Lawson looked at him steadily. Mr. Crow, she said, this court does not enforce harmony by stripping competent adults of their rights. She turned to Marissa and Greg. You mistook access for entitlement, she said. That misunderstanding ends today? Marissa sat down heavily as if the weight of the room had finally reached her. Greg stared at the table. Judge Lawson glanced at the clock. This court is prepared to rule, she said. My heart didn't race. It didn't need to, because no matter how this ended legally, something far more important had already ended emotionally. The illusion. Judge Lawson looked directly at me. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, you have conducted yourself with restraint, clarity, and dignity under accusation. She paused. And the court finds that. She stopped, just for a moment, long enough for Marissa to look up. Long enough for Greg to tense. Long enough for Daniel Crow to stop breathing. And that was when I realized something quietly powerful. No matter what words followed, they would never laugh at me again. Because the sentence the judge was about to speak wouldn't just decide this case, it would redefine our family forever. The petition is denied. Judge Rebecca Lawson's voice was calm, firm, and final. The words didn't echo, but they landed. I felt them settle into the room like dust after a collapse. Marissa let out a sharp breath, as if the air had been punched from her lungs. Greg's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he was steadying himself on a moving floor. Daniel Crow blinked once, then straightened, already shifting into damage control mode. But the judge wasn't finished. This court finds no evidence, medical, legal, or behavioral, that supports a finding of mental incompetence, Judge Lawson continued. Mrs. Alina Whitfield is fully capable of managing her affairs. She paused. And this court further finds that the petition was filed in bad faith. That did echo. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marissa's head snapped up. Your Honor, Judge Lawson raised one finger. I am speaking. Marissa fell silent. Bad faith, the judge repeated, does not always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from entitlement disguised as concern. She looked directly at Marissa. This was not a misunderstanding, it was an assumption. Then she turned to Greg. And assumptions have consequences. Daniel Crow stood quickly. Your Honor, if I may. No, Judge Lawson said without raising her voice. You may not. That alone told me everything. She leaned back in her chair, eyes steady, voice precise. This court is issuing a formal warning. Any further attempts to challenge Mrs. Whitfield's capacity without new, substantive evidence will be considered harassment. Marissa's face crumpled. Greg stared straight ahead. And, the judge added, this court strongly recommends that Mrs. Whitfield review her estate plans with independent counsel. I almost smiled. She wasn't protecting me from myself. She was protecting me from them. With a sharp tap of her gavel, Judge Lawson concluded, court is adjourned. Just like that, it was over, or so they thought. The courtroom began to empty slowly, papers shuffled, chairs scraped. Conversations whispered behind hands. Marissa stood hesitantly as if unsure whether to approach me or flee. Daniel Crow leaned in toward her. We should talk privately, he murmured. Greg nodded stiffly. Yeah, now. They turned to leave. Marissa, I said. My voice was quiet, but it stopped her. She turned. For the first time since Charles died, we were standing in the open, no lawyers, no assumptions, no courtroom masks. Yes, she asked. I want you to understand something, I said. Today wasn't about money. Her eyes filled. Then why does it feel like I lost everything? I held her gaze. Because you didn't lose an inheritance, I said gently. You lost control? Greg scoffed from behind her. You planned this. No, I replied. I survived it. Marissa's shoulders sagged. Mom, I really thought I was helping. I nodded slowly. That's the lie people tell themselves when they don't want to admit they were afraid of being left out. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Greg placed a hand on her arm. Let's go. They walked away. I didn't follow. I didn't call after them. Some lessons need space to settle. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt strangely warm, like it hadn't noticed the storm that had just passed. I sat on a stone bench, my handbag resting beside me, breathing deeply. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed, a message from Marissa. I don't know who you are anymore. I stared at the screen for a long time, then I typed back. You never asked. I put the phone away. That night I went home alone. Charles's study was just as I'd left it, books neatly arranged, his reading glasses on the desk, the faint smell of cedar and paper. I sat in his chair. And for the first time since he died, I let myself cry, not because of the lawsuit, not because of Marissa, but because Charles had been right. He'd known this would happen. He'd trusted me to stand when it did. On his desk sat a sealed envelope I hadn't opened yet. I'd been saving it, because part of me wasn't ready, but now I was. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable for a leaner, if they ever challenge you. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter, and beneath it documents. Documents Marissa and Greg had never seen, documents that explained everything. And as I read the first line of Charles's letter, my breath caught, because suddenly I understood. The court case wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And when Marissa finally learned what her father had truly planned, she would realize something far more devastating than losing money. She would realize how deeply she had misjudged us both. I read Charles's letter 3 times before I truly understood it, not because the words were complicated, but because they were devastating in their clarity. Alina, if you're reading this, it means they finally did what I feared. They questioned you instead of trusting you. My throat tightened. I need you to remember something before you read any further. None of what follows is punishment. It is protection. I closed my eyes for a moment. Charles had always chosen his words carefully. He never reacted. He planned. Marissa believes this is about money. Greg believes it's about control. Neither of them understands what I was actually protecting. I turned the page. Inside the envelope were documents, trust amendments, notarized statements, dated notes in Charles's precise handwriting. And then I saw it, a clause I had forgotten. Or maybe never been meant to remember until now, the family responsibility trust. I felt my breath slow. Charles had created it 5 years ago, not quietly, deliberately. The trust didn't give Marissa anything outright. It required something first, demonstrated conduct. Charles had written it plainly. Any beneficiary must show consistent respect, honesty, and good faith toward Alina Whitfield for a period of no less than 24 months following my death. Not gifts, not apologies, behavior. My hands shook as I read further. If any beneficiary initiates legal action challenging Alina's competence or intent, that action will be considered a breach of trust conditions. I sat back in the chair. Marissa hadn't just lost the case, she had triggered the clause, and Charles had anticipated exactly how. I finally understood. The will wasn't cruel, it was precise. The next morning, I received another message from Marissa. Greg says Dad never would have wanted this. I stared at it for a long time, then I replied. Greg never knew your father the way he thought he did. An hour later, my phone rang. Marissa. I answered. Mom, she said, her voice unsteady. What did Dad leave you? Everything, I replied. No, she said quickly. I mean instructions, conditions. I didn't answer right away. You lost the case, I said instead. That's not what I'm asking. I know, I said softly. That's the problem. There was a long silence. Then quietly, did I ruin something? I looked out the window at the garden Charles used to tend. Yes, I said. But not what you think. Then tell me, she pleaded. I can't, I replied. Not yet. Greg took the phone. Eleanor, he said sharply, you don't get to play games now, the court ruled you won. Isn't that enough? This was never a game, I said. Well, it sure looks like one, he snapped. You embarrassed us, you made Marissa look like a monster. You did that yourselves, I replied calmly. He scoffed. So what now? You cut her off forever? No, I said. I gave her exactly what her father gave her. And what's that? A choice. He laughed bitterly. You expect her to beg now? No, I said. I expect her to learn. The line went dead. That afternoon, Daniel Crowe called. Mrs. Whitfield, he said carefully, I'm no longer representing Marissa and Greg. I assumed as much, I replied. There's something you should know, he continued. Greg is pushing her to appeal. I closed my eyes. On what grounds? I asked. Emotional manipulation, he said. He believes if he reframes the narrative, he'll make it worse, I interrupted. Daniel exhaled. Yes, that evening there was a knock at my door. I didn't expect visitors, but when I opened it, Marissa stood there alone. No Greg, no lawyer, no performance. She looked smaller. Can I come in? She asked. I stepped aside. She sat on the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap. I read Dad's old emails, she said suddenly. The ones he sent you? I didn't respond. He talked about me, she continued. About Greg. About how he worried I confused love with entitlement. Her voice broke. Why didn't you tell me he felt that way? I sat across from her. Because he wanted you to show him he was wrong, I said. She nodded slowly. I think I did the opposite. Silence settled between us. Finally, she whispered, Is there anything I can do? I looked at her, the daughter I raised, the woman she'd become, the child still buried somewhere beneath fear and expectation. Yes, I said. She looked up quickly. Stop listening to Greg. Her face crumpled. That's harder than it sounds. I know, I said gently, but it's necessary. She nodded again. Then quietly, if I actually try, does Dad's trust? I held up my hand. This isn't about the trust anymore. Her eyes widened. Then what is it about? I leaned forward. Who you choose to be when there's nothing left to gain? Tears slipped down her cheeks. I handed her a tissue. She stood to leave a few minutes later. At the door, she paused. Mom, she said, I don't know if I can fix this. I'm not asking you to fix it, I replied. I'm asking you not to break it further. She left. That night, I returned to Charles's letter. The final line caught my breath. If Marissa ever chooses humility over entitlement, you'll know. And when she does, trust yourself. I folded the letter carefully. Because now the real test had begun. And in the next chapter, Marissa would be forced to make a decision, one that would either restore what she'd lost or destroy it forever. The morning Marissa made her choice, she didn't call first. She didn't text. She didn't warn me. She just showed up. It was early, too early for excuses, too early for rehearsed apologies. I knew something was different the moment I opened the door. She wasn't dressed to impress. No makeup, no jewelry, no careful posture, just my daughter standing there with tired eyes and a resolve that hadn't been there before. I ended it, she said. I stepped aside and let her in. With Greg, she added quietly. I told him I wouldn't appeal. I told him I wouldn't fight you. I told him I needed space. I didn't react, not because I didn't care, but because this moment wasn't about my response. It was about her standing on her own feet. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd once done homework, the same one where Charles used to read the paper while correcting her grammar with a smile. I read the trust documents, she said, the ones Dad drafted. I nodded. I didn't know he thought that far ahead, she whispered. He always did, I replied. Especially when it came to you, her eyes filled. I kept thinking he chose you over me, she said, but now I see he chose responsibility, she swallowed, and he left me a chance. I folded my hands. Yes, I said, he did. There was a long pause. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. Do I still have one? I looked at her carefully, not as a judge, not as a gatekeeper, but as a mother who had learned painfully that love without boundaries becomes surrender. The trust is still intact, I said. Legally. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. But I continued, that doesn't mean anything has been restored. She nodded. I know, she said. I'm not asking for money. That surprised me. I'm asking if we can start over, slowly, honestly, without lawyers, without assumptions. I studied her face. For the first time since Charles died, she wasn't asking what she deserved. She was asking what was required. I can't promise you forgiveness, I said gently, And I won't pretend this didn't hurt. I wouldn't trust you if you did, she replied. That made me smile just a little. So we started with something small, coffee once a week. No discussions about the estate, no updates about Greg, just conversations, sometimes awkward, sometimes quiet, sometimes painful, but real. 3 months later, Daniel Crowe sent me a formal letter. Marissa had withdrawn all remaining motions. Permanently. 6 months later, Judge Rebecca Lawson signed the final dismissal. And 1 year later, I did something I hadn't planned on doing at all. I amended the trust. Not to restore everything, not to erase consequences, but to reflect growth. Charles had been right, behavior matters. Marissa earned back part of what she lost, not because she asked, but because she changed. Greg never did. He moved on quickly, found someone else, found another story where he was the wronged one. That no longer concerned me because the real victory wasn't in court. It was at my dinner table. 2 plates instead of 1, no tension, no fear. No calculations, just honesty. One evening, Marissa looked at me and said, "I thought strength meant control." I shook my head. "No," I said, "strength is knowing when you don't need it." She nodded slowly. "I wish I'd learned that sooner." "So do I said, "but learning late is better than never." I still live in the same house. I still carry the same handbag. And if you saw me on the street, you might still underestimate me. That's fine. I know who I am now. I'm not naive, I'm not weak, and I wasn't lucky. I was prepared. And when the judge looked up that day and froze, it wasn't because of my past. It was because of everything I refused to give away. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters too.